All right. Looks like we're live now, so we'll go ahead and tweet that. Ready? How we publicize it? A live stream of me tweeting stuff. Okay, here we go. Live now. I tried to hashtag PSR-7 and it just hashtagged PSR. So.
Oh, don't do a dash. Just,
Yeah.
Just do PSR-7. Yeah.
I just learned that just now.
I learned that a few weeks ago.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to pull up the show notes and we will begin.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. If you're listening live and want to be a part of the show, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with your question, and we'll try to get your question answered if we can. Today we're discussing the PHP Framework Interop Group's newest accepted member to the standards library, PSR-7. We'll discuss what PSR-7 is and talk about some of its key features. We'll also look at how you can implement PSR-7 in your own project. And I'm being joined at the roundtable today with some of the key players in making PSR-7 a reality. So without further ado, let's meet those key players. And in no particular order, let's start off here with Larry Garfield. He is the senior architect of Planeteer, I'm saying this wrong, Planeteer.net, and a lead developer, core developer, for Drupal, and we try to discuss how I would say this. It's a leading Drupal core developer.
I'll just take over for you here. Senior architect at Palantir.net and a leading Drupal core developer.
And Palantir.net has hosted the Chicago PHP user group and is a great venue. So they're great people to work with, I'm sure. So welcome. Thanks for joining, Larry.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Also, we have the project lead for Zen Framework and Appagility, Mr. Matthew Weier O'Phinney.
Are we supposed to salute?
No, absolutely not.
That's Cal Evans' thing, right?
Yeah, that's Cal Evans.
Well, thanks for joining, Matthew.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Beau Simensen. He's the creator of Sculpin and co-host of that podcast, which I'm a fan of. Welcome, Beau.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, second time around or third time. Actually, you were in like you were in the Midwest PHP one, and so you're a regular.
Yep.
And Matthew, you were in another. Actually, all you guys have been on before. So
yeah, I was at Sunshine PHP.
Yeah, so all recurring peeps. That's awesome. Well, let's go ahead and kick this thing off. Before we get into too many technical details on PSR-7, I'm just kind of curious about each of you, how you got involved with even being in part of this process. So, Beau, you want to kick it off? Like, how did you get involved with PSR-7, and what did you do with it?
I didn't actually do a lot of it. I've been tracking it since Benjamin Aberle first introduced the FIG HB client proposal. So I've been really interested in it ever since then to see where that would go. It also is something that was pretty close to me because it could really help a lot with one of the projects that I'm working on, which is called Stack, which is a middleware project for Symfony projects or Symfony-based projects. So yeah, I've been super excited to see where it was going to go. Even though it started out as mostly a client interface to start with, I was really excited to see what would happen to it if it decided to go in the direction of also supporting server-side HTTP messages as well.
Cool. What about you, Larry? How did you get involved?
So I've been interested in the topic ever since it was first proposed, although I wasn't heavily involved for a long time. As Beau mentioned, it actually has mutated an awful lot since the initial the initial version. I'd say I got really involved after Matthew took over as the editor for it because I saw actual momentum and it was going somewhere good, and I'm a big supporter and advocate of cross-project collaboration and interoperability and not reinventing the wheel. And this particular problem space is one that is so fundamental that, if done right, can be seriously awesome for all of PHP, and if done wrong, would be a huge, terrible thing for all of PHP. And so I wanted to make sure that it was done well, so dug in as much as I could in the time I had.
Cool. And Matthew, what about you? How did you get involved?
Well, first I rage quit FIG 2 years ago, and then stopped paying attention. That's another story, yeah. No, actually, it was funny. It's been kind of on my radar. I've known it was in the background for a while. What got me really started on it was we were doing an experimental port of App Agility to Node last summer, and it was amazing. I was able to do like the entire engine, port the engine from PHP to Node in a matter of like a week, and it was largely due to the fact that everything was done on middleware. And the reason middleware worked so well, as it turned out, was because there's a great HTTP abstraction in Node already. And I wanted to port the middleware concept that I was working with, which was from Sencha Connect to PHP. And of course, the first hurdle was, oh gosh, I need an HTTP abstraction. And I knew about Stack, and I took a look at Stack, and I noticed that what I wanted to do was different than what Stack was advocating. And so one of the things I thought about, was do I use the Symfony ones? Do I use the framework ones? And thought, maybe making it agnostic would make more sense, because then I might get more people to look at it and be interested. And so then I remembered PSR-7. I'd seen some blog posts from Michael Dowling and a few others. I went to look at it. I was like, oh, this is cool. And then there was no implementation. So I took a weekend and wrote an implementation and went and posted it to the FIG group, only to discover that Michael had just stepped down as editor. And he had been focusing on the client side, which was what Benjamin Eberle had originally suggested was for client interfaces. So Michael was coming from Bezel. He was very wrapped up in the idea of on the client interfaces, but I was looking at it from the potential from server side. How do we do this middleware? So I was totally interested in seeing it push forward. I thought there were some great ideas in there. And so after some really long, hard thinking, I think it took 2 or 3 weeks for me to come work up the courage to go in and say, yeah, okay, I'll step in again. I talked to Beau at Madison PHP last year, and he essentially said, sure, go for it, I'll sponsor. And Paul Jones also stepped up, so I became editor at that point.
Nice. Well, if you're joining and listening and have never heard of the FIG, the PHP FIG, you should definitely Google it. And it's played a pretty big role in how developers do things on the web as far as their code. And it's really been great to help this whole PHP ecosystem to kind of work a little bit better together, a little bit more collaborative. And if you're not familiar with the PSRs, check them out. The latest one that we're talking about today is PSR-7. So in a nutshell, Larry, what is PSR-7? Or as who is oh shoot. I had a joke in here, but I didn't write it in the show notes. So
when you remember the joke,
think of the joke later. But what is a PSR-7 in a nutshell?
So PSR-7 is an abstraction of HTTP messages in PHP. PHP's native support for HTTP is actually based on CGI, circa 1992 or something ancient like that. Which is not actually the way HTTP works. So PSR-7 is a series of interfaces for objects that represent the actual HTTP specification from the IETF. Technically version 1.1, but at the level we're talking about, there's really no difference for HTTP2. The idea being that if you can represent those messages correctly, and you can represent those in a solid, clear way, then doing intelligent things based on the incoming request and the outgoing response, which is like the entirety of what we do in PHP, becomes a lot easier and a lot more interchangeable between different projects or different libraries and so forth. So it's representing HTTP messages in the most robust form we can manage. Matthew, is that a decent description?
Yeah, so like HTTP, this idea, these requests and responses and these messages that are being sent back and forth between servers, this is kind of at the core of what we as web developers have to deal with. So it seems like this is a pretty important standard to kind of get out there to how we interface with these things that we do every single day. And it seems like this could have almost been PSR-0, right? Like maybe this should have been the first thing we were looking at for standardizing, but of course we had to care about tabs versus spaces first. That's more important.
Auto-loading. Auto-loading.
Auto-loading.
Auto-loading is kind of important. It was the FIG's first appearance in the world, before it was called FIG, was the PSR-0 auto-loading standard, which was... The way it was presented and announced was a textbook example of how not to do things, but the net effect of it over time was extremely positive. It came out just as PHP 5.3 did, which was just the right time, and really ushered in that was a major part of the PHP renaissance of the 5.3 and later era.
True. So PSR-7 actually presents there's these interfaces, and if you're not familiar with interfaces, it's basically this contract that you can tack onto a class, and it says that this contract is guaranteed to have these methods on it. If I were to look at the PSR-7 interface or interfaces, what would I find? Is there just one interface that says, oh, this is PSR-7, or how does that work exactly?
Matthew, you want to take that one?
I'll take that one. So at the base level, all HTTP messages have two common features, and those are headers and the message body itself. So we have a message interface that encapsulates those aspects of it. Then we have the request interface, and a request has the request line, which includes the method by which that it's being used, the request target, which may or may not be a URI, and then the version, the protocol version for HTTP that's being used. For a response, so that's our request interface, it builds on top of the message interface and adds features around that. The response has a status line, and that has your status code and optionally a reason phrase as well as the protocol version. So that's our response interface, adds features around that. Now, in terms of the request, you have a URI, so we have a URI interface as well, because one of the things we discovered is there's a lot of pain points, let's say, around accessing the various components of a URI, because a URI has a scheme, it has optionally some user information, it has a host, it might have a port if it's a non-standard port, it's got a path, query, fragment, and all that stuff. So we want to make it easy for you to get at those aspects of it.
They're actually a lot more complicated than most people realize. That's
right.
One of the, I think, threads through all of PSR-7 is people think, oh, this thing should be simple, and then you get into it and all the actual nuance that exists in practice, and it's not really that simple.
It's not.
That's why these robust interfaces need to exist to help standardize the lack of simplicity.
Exactly, and one of the pieces too is like, yes, PHP offers parse URL, which will give you the components, but even that, there's a little bit of unpredictability about what will be there, and unless you're on a late version of PHP, you're, for instance, can't even use a ternary to do the checks because the isset will fail and raise an error. So there's some just kind of pain points there. So we have a URI interface on top of this. Now, when it comes to server-side stuff, we're used to in PHP having the super globals, right? So your get, your post, your cookie, your server, all these different super globals exist to make it easy to get at that stuff. So we have a server request interface that builds on the request interface, and it adds accessors for getting at those collections. On top of that, again, there's always another layer. One of the things that came up late in the process was a recognition that _files actually has some problems inherent in the language and the implementation, particularly when you have arrays of files. And so we wanted to have a normalized structure so that when you get one of these items off of there, or if you're using nested items, whatever, you always end up with something usable instead of having to aggregate it from various other pieces. So we have an uploaded file interface that allows you to get at the various aspects of what is normally the _files, a single item and _files. It also adds behavior. This is like the only interface that has behavior, and it has a move to method that allows you to basically emulate move uploaded file, and it will, by default, it's supposed to use the SAPI implementation underneath it so that garbage collection happens. And it also has a way to retrieve it as a stream, which is a really nice use case. Now, streams, that's the next part. It keeps going down the rabbit hole, right?
Yeah.
That's the next piece that I want to talk about. Underlying all of this, we have the message body, and then we have uploaded files, which are usually part of the message body. Michael Dowling recognized early on that these should be actual streams. And this may seem like, why do you do that? It's just a string, right? Well, yes and no. It could be binary data. It could be JSON. It could be HTML. It could be really tiny, or it could be incredibly large. And when it gets in incredibly large, you want it to be a stream so that you're not consuming a lot of memory and processing power in order to deliver it or accept it. The other thing is that when you're transferring things, like say for instance you have an uploaded file that you know you're just going to deliver straight out to S3 anyway, why not just do that as a stream? Because then there's very little processing overhead that happens. What I have observed working on ZenFramework 2 is we actually had some incredibly hacky solutions for dealing with streams, because like even if you're wanting to return a file from the server side, our default responses in all of these different frameworks is doing them as strings. And as a string, you're eating up all this memory. And so we actually had to add in support for streaming a file back. So doing it as a stream makes a lot of sense. If you look at things like Rack and WSGI and Node, they actually already model them as streams. And if you look at PHP, we do as well. It's just that you don't realize it. So you have your PHP input stream. You've got your PHP output stream, which is the output buffer. We're already doing streams. It's just that we mask them, and we've actually abstracted past them to a point where we've broken it. So that was one of the things that we did as well. So there's a stream interface that lets you model the message or an uploaded file as a stream so that you can have these nice performance benefits, but it also gives a uniform API for being able to basically search over it and get extract segments of it and everything in a very performant and memory saving way. So those are, I think I've covered all of the interfaces at this point. So
I guess the most surprising for me was the URL interface and just how complicated it was for representing something universal resource locator or whatever.
I blame Larry for it. No, just kidding.
No, I'll take it honestly. One of the things I was really pushing on very hard during the development process for PSR-7 was strong typing. PHP is not a strongly typed language. Until you get to PHP 7, we don't have scalar types, but the principles of strong typing, that is, I call this method, and these are the only types of parameters I can pass in, and this is the only type I'm going to get back. And I don't need to wrap if statements around it to figure out, okay, is this a this thing or is this a that thing? That's something PHP is not that used to doing. We're used to returning whatever and guessing, but return whatever and guess is a terrible thing when you're trying to build a really robust platform. So I pushed very hard for, there is only one type, only one data type that can come back from a given method. So, get URI, for example, on the request, we could say, okay, you get back a string and you have to parse it yourself, but then there's 17 different ways that could get parsed, and then you have to do all that work yourself. Or we could say, we'll parse it for you and give you back an array, and these are the conditions to think about in the array, which is what PHP does natively. And that is no better because you still have all these if conditionals lying around. Or we could say, you know what? We're going to pre-parse it for you and wrap it in methods that do the edge case handling for you, because why should everyone have to do that themselves? And so we just create a value object that represents a URI, and you can interact with that, and it has a stable API with known types and known behavior, and it's predictable, and you can rely on it. And that just makes your code need a lot less edge case handling and a lot less error checking, which means less for you to forget to do and therefore have bugs.
Now you mentioned value objects, and that's quite a different tangent.
Can I actually, before we go into that, I want to build on something Larry said here. He talks about the benefits of strong typing. it actually, by modeling this URI as an object, actually allowed us to simplify aspects of the request interface. One of the big questions towards the end was, what is the relationship between the URI and the host header? And before we were doing all these things, we were even having Boolean flags, which Beau was just pushing against it. Why do we have this? And
Thank you, Beau.
And yeah, no, it was great, and I'm glad he was pushing against it, but we couldn't figure out a way. But because we had this object, we were able to basically say, hey, we know that there's a host. If there's a host in there, then we update the host header, and we're able to do that. And if there's no host in there, we don't update it. And so it made it possible to simplify this in many different ways. So we got to we benefited from the strict typing right off the bat, even within the PSR itself.
There's I forget which famous computer scientists who, like 40 years ago, observed that most of the hard work of programming is and should be in your data structures. If your data structures are well designed, the code around them becomes really easy. If your data structures are poorly designed, the code around it becomes really ugly. Mm-hmm. And what we're building here are data structures. Right. And so we wanted to make sure that we put a lot of effort into getting the data structures right, because that makes the code around it a lot easier.
Now, you're hitting on like a really important concept that might be new to a lot of people. We've touched on it a little bit in the domain-driven design episode of the PHP Roundtable. I can't remember which number that was, but we talked about this concept of value objects and entities and things like that. We also touched on an idea of immutability and mutability. And the real TLDR version of that is that if it's mutable, it means you can modify it. If it's immutable, it's read-only. So if you have an object and you can change a property on it that after it's already been instantiated, then it's mutable. If you can't, then it's immutable. So that concept, that differentiation of immutable and mutable, has actually played a pretty key role in PSR-7. Who was the driving force behind that, and like why did you choose to do focus on immutability for PSR-7?
I think the irony is all of us started off being against immutability.
Yes. Yeah, there were some discussions on the list about maybe they should be modeled as immutable. I got into a Twitter fight at one point with a bunch of people who were really urging it, and I actually then I got really angry and everything. I cut off Twitter for the rest of the day and started thinking about it. So why am I angry about this? And I realized I'm angry about it because it's wrong. It's like, no, is it wrong, or do I really know all the facts? And what it came down to is I had this idea of immutability in my head that seemed like it was going to be too tough for the average developer. So I thought, okay, so if it's really just a personal thing, why don't I give it a try? And so I gave it a try, and actually I was able to get rid of like a third of the code in my implementation by making these immutable. And it also solved some problems I'd been having trouble with on a middleware library I was working on, and made those simpler. And I was like, okay, I can see the benefits here. What it comes down to is, we already were talking about them as value objects, and so the next extension of that is immutability. So when we talk about the value objects, essentially what you have is an aggregation of scalar values, typically, but it can also be other value objects. So in the case of request, it's also got the URI as a value object. It's one of the values within it. But the true test of a value object is that the identity is based on the aggregate of the properties it encompasses. So if you change even one of those, it's a different value. And this maps actually really, really well to HTTP, because if you look at 7230, RFC 7230, it actually talks about if you change any aspect of a message, it is a different message. And so when we start looking at it that way, it's like, yeah, these have to be immutable. And so what does that mean? It just means that any method that would normally, we had all these set methods before, right? We changed them to with. And what it means is that, I want this value with this, and so it gives me a new instance with that. But they're now two separate instances, one which is the original message, and two which is the modified message. And that's it. That's all there is to it, and it seems foreign at first, but all it means is that you have to reassign if you want to keep using that value. So I say request with header, and I assign it back to request. I'm good to go. There are great reasons not to do that. So like with middleware, I might want to actually pass in that new value as I invoke the next middleware, but retain the original value so I can do comparisons later, which is a really, really awesome feature. if I look at a client, I might have a base request that has a certain URL, and what I can do is I can, over the looping, I can go through and basically build up my request from that base request without having to go into any weird cloning crap because it's already taken care of because it's a value object. So those are really fun examples, I think.
And in my case, I'm a fan of immutability in general, and I would argue, so I know, Sammy, you've heard me argue this, that there's objects that do things and objects that are things, and the objects that do things are services. Those should always be immutable, period. Don't even talk to me. But for objects that represent data, it becomes trickier if you want them to be actually usable. And part of that is a lot of the immutable objects I've seen in the wild only allow mutation at constructor time, which means you have an object that has 15 constructor parameters, usually undocumented because PHP, and then, or they're constructed with a gigantic array, which is undocumented because PHP, and then, once you're done with it, okay, now I can't do anything with it. I can't modify it. I can't create a new one to replace it without extracting everything out of it and passing it into this whole new gigantic constructor, and it's just a mess. And I've seen those type of objects before, and I hate them. And that was really why I was against using immutability for the request and response, because it seemed like that meant, oh, you had to know everything up front and pass it into a big constructor, at which point, why not just use a function and a giant array? When Matthew, back in January, I think it was, early January, did his, all right, I'll prove you wrong that the immutability doesn't work. Oh, wait, it does. I followed on with pretty much the same logic of, Matthew, you idiot, this is a terrible idea, I'll prove you wrong. And so took a day and basically did a PSR-7 implementation of stack PHP, more or less. And found it actually worked really well because it had these chaining modifiers. At the time, they were still called sets. They got renamed to with, but that's really what makes the immutable objects work and be a good developer experience, is that ability to say, yes, they're value objects, but I can still easily quote modify them. And those listening on the podcast don't see me doing scare quotes here. But you can modify them that way, sort of modify them that way, and spawn new versions, and it feels natural. But you're still looking at, I've got this distinct object here, and that was really nice to work with, actually. And then you also get all the benefits of immutability, most of which boil down to predictability. You don't have things changing out from under you at random times, which means you can make a lot more assumptions about your code and therefore eliminate lots of code. A lot of error handling code goes away. A lot of trying to use messages as a way to pass data around as a pseudo-global. A lot of that goes away, and you just don't have to worry about it anymore. But when you need to spawn new copies that are slightly different, it's dead simple to do. And that, I think, is really, really powerful, and a model that I'm hoping a lot of other PHP efforts end up adopting, because I think it really has a lot of potential to just change the way we think about modeling our content and our data throughout a system.
Yes, it's definitely changed my perspective a lot of just trying to think, like, if I can make this immutable, is it going to be better? And almost like 85% of the time, it's always yes. Yeah. It would be better and easier to work with.
And one of the add-ons there, I'll note, one of the concerns that we had was performance, because this means you're potentially creating lots and lots of objects, and is that going to be a performance problem on either CPU or memory? And it turns out that because PHP is copy on write and is pretty good at that, it's not a big performance hit unless you're doing an awful lot of modification, like chaining hundreds of methods together. So the performance impact for your typical web application...
Thousands is what I found. I mean, it was a ridiculous amount that you needed to do for it to have any impact.
Yeah, so, in terms of either CPU usage or memory usage, the benchmarks say this is really no slower than what we're used to with a mutable object, but you get all these other benefits because the PHP engine actually does a really good job of making you not care.
Well, I've got a question for you guys. Since PSR-7 is just, I know it's the set of rules that you have to read to make sure you're implementing correctly, but then once you pull in the interfaces into your code, you can get a green light that's saying, yes, you've implemented everything good, you're PSR-7 compliant, but I think there might be a loophole that, that might be pretty big for developers when they're implementing PSR-7, and that is, it surrounds this immutability idea, is that if they return the value this, as opposed to creating a new instance of that object, there's a difference between that being mutable and immutable. So I don't know if I'm describing this enough to where everybody can understand what I'm saying, but is there any way that through static analysis or through education or whatever that implementations of PSR-7 could not go awry by making mutable instances of all these objects?
So, interestingly, really good timing on this. One of the Zen Framework contributors, he goes by the handle Max3W. I know his real name, but he's asked to keep it anonymous. He's actually working on a PSR-7 testbed right now, and the idea is that you would then plug in your implementations, and it would test to make sure it's complying with the interfaces. And so that, I'm hoping that we can actually, once he gets completed with that, that we can add that to the PHP FIG organization, and you'd be able to say it is compliant because it passes the tests. And that would be, for me, the best way of doing this. And there has been quite a few people have called on that, and that's why I tested all the different assumptions and behaviors in Diactoros as I was developing it, is I wanted to make sure of that. The funny part is Max has found some places where I didn't get up to date with the very latest bits and pieces. So a few places where I was returning null where I should have returned empty strings, stuff like that. So he's correcting those as he goes, which is really awesome. But that would be the best way, is if we have a test suite.
So is it a suite?
Yes, it's a suite.
Well, I'll ask Beau. Beau, you've been pretty quiet. What kind of projects would benefit from PSR-7? If I had an open source project, what's the perfect candidate to implement PSR-7?
Well, obvious cases would be if you want to build some sort of middleware. So if you have a project, so maybe you have like a security project that operates at the HTTP layer, that would be a great candidate for building something off PSR-7. Pretty much any other project that you can basically extract all of your code out that has to do with the framework and just build framework agnostic middleware, not middleware, but framework agnostic controllers, you'd be able to leverage PSR-7. So for example, if you have a tiny application, maybe a little blog application that only needs to read the request, do some simple things with the response, you could write that and drop it into Laravel, or you could drop it into Zend, or drop it into, how do you pronounce the new package name, Matthew?
Diactoros.
Diactoros? Yeah. You could,
it's great.
Right. You could pass it into a homegrown framework built around that. So basically, if you have anything that you can isolate and pull out all of the framework bits, you'd be able to leverage PSR-7 and make it so that you're free to run that application pretty much anywhere that supports PSR-7.
I'll give you another example. A couple of months ago, I was working on a project in Symfony where, among other things, we had a proxy layer. So we had a front end in JavaScript that was talking to a Symfony app, which was forwarding the requests onto another Symfony app after doing some logic. And that forwarding meant us taking code in from Symfony's request object, dissecting it, turning it into a guzzle request, signing, doing some request signing on that using Guzzle's interface, sending that message, getting the response back, verifying the signature, dissecting it, converting it back to a Symfony object, or Symfony response object, and sending that back. And then we had to do the same kind of signing logic on the further back-end piece. And just there's too much code going on there. If everything is using PSR-7 in there, then I take a request, I slap a new header on it, and I pass it to the next object, or pass the altered version to the next object. And when the response comes back, I just return that response directly, and everything still magically works. It's just a lot of code that goes away because I don't have to think about two different ways of representing this request when all I'm doing is passing it from one system to another.
So you're alluding to something that Beau mentioned, and that is middleware, right? So if somebody had never used middleware before, how would you describe that to them?
There's a couple of different.
It's code that lives between a request and a response. So it gets a request coming in and it returns a response is the idea. That's the most simplest form. I've seen 3 or 4 different major patterns of it. It can be a function accepting a request that returns a response. It can be a function accepting a request and a response that returns a response. And the other pattern is a function returning, expecting a request response, and then a callable that is essentially the next middleware or will invoke the next middleware. And that's the third pattern. So the first one is kind of what I would call the lambda pattern. I just did the scare quotes there.
Which is what Symfony and Stack and Silex use.
It's yeah, exactly. Symfony, Stack, and Silex use the now Laravel and Lumen use the lambda model. The request response model is what WSGI does, and also what the Zen Framework 2's dispatchable interface. I've seen a few other implementations. And then the third one, actually, if I remember correctly, Slim versions 1 and 2 also use the second one I did with the request and response. And then the third one is the one that Connect made popular in Node and Express.js by extension. And that's the one that Slim 3 is using. Strategility, which is the middleware project that I did that ported Connect, and now Relay, I think, is the new word, is the new term for Paul's new one. It was Pipeline, and now I think it's Relay, is also using that pattern. And just to be fair, Larry noted in the show notes that Lambda pattern is a term that he coined during some discussions. So,
it's good to give names to these things.
Exactly. I call them Lambda. I can't remember what I call the second one, but the third one I call the workflow or pipeline style. So.
Well, Michael Dowling recently tweeted, why are there several PHP middleware libraries that require a response in the method signature? I thought it's supposed to return a response. So he's referring to, he thought it should be the Lambda sort of structure, and he's kind of questioning this different type of way of implementation. What are there like specific reasons why you would do one sort of method signature versus another one?
Sure. So the first two I specified, you have to have some way of injecting other middleware in there if you want to be able to call it. And so if you look at Stack has it's not part of the interface, but it's one of the conventions around it, is that you pass in the app or other middleware as to the constructor or through a setter, but then it's a standard property on there and you call it. Passing the callable or the stack to the function means that it doesn't have to be aware at all of how to do it, which means that you can actually use closures very easily without wrapping them or anything. So you can have a hybrid style of middleware where you have both classes and you have callables and everything in there. The reason that some of them have the response is that you can then type in only on PSR-7, and the actual middlewares don't have to import any implementation of PSR-7. They just have to know about the interfaces, which is awesome. So what that means is that you don't. Yeah. So well, except for if you are if you don't accept the response in there, what it means is that you have to have a dependency on a concrete version so that you can create and return the response. Is the idea. And so it's not that the one is better than or worse than the other. It's just that you have to think about what are the trade-offs between these different things. I have a longer method signature when I'm doing the workflow style, but I don't have to know anything about any concretions at that point. The other style might be a better one for you have to know the concretions, but it is a very simple, direct Lambda style. I love it actually. I like all of the styles, but I would use them in different circumstances.
Gotcha. I have one quick question before we kind of move it on to a little bit more ideas specifically for a package I've been working on. But I saw that there was an attributes. I guess I don't know if it's an interface, but there were references to attributes in PSR-7. And what's the difference between attributes and key value pairs from a param and a URL?
So attributes are a very amusing part of the spec, I think, because we debated them at length, and during the course of that discussion, we saw some of the Symfony folks drifting towards recommending the way Zen does things, and the Zen folks drifting towards the way Symfony does things. So
interesting.
The attributes are part of the server request interface specifically, so they're not part of the raw message. They're part of the special case of a message that is coming in, the server side coming into a PHP process, which has a couple of extra bits and pieces on it, like Matthew mentioned, and one of them is attributes. If you've used the attributes bag in Symfony HTTP Foundation, it's that. That's pretty much what it is. The idea being that it's a place for you to put a small amount of derived information, things like negotiating what the format of the request is, or extracting parameters out of the request based on routing. You can store those in the attributes. So it's kind of it is just a key value pair of application-specific data, and applications have to agree with each other on what those keys are going to mean. But I mean, really, anyone who's worked with Symfony or Silex or anything else using HTTP Foundation, which includes Drupal now, it's pretty much the exact same idea as the Symfony attributes. It's just not in a nested object. So
it's metadata, basically, about the message?
Yeah, and usually it's data that's derived from the request itself. So it'll be, like Larry said, it might be stuff that's derived from the process of routing, which is going to maybe look at the URL, it might look at the request method, it might even look at some of the server environment stuff, which we have server params for. So usually it's derived, but it's basically saying, okay, I derived this stuff, I matched these aspects, and so I'm going to put these attributes in there, which give it a simpler way of determining, what was actually matched, so that I can just start operating on it instead of having to match again myself.
So you can attach other things like say, a security token, for example.
Yes.
If a middleware determines that this request was made by a specific user, you can put like user ID equals and then an ID on the attribute, or if it's a token or something else like that. Basically, it's some way for a middleware or some other part of the system to look at the request, determine something about it, and then make it more accessible to something downstream listening for those requests.
It allows middlewares to communicate with each other on the request side, server request side.
Oh, okay, cool. So like I had one middleware that was looking at it before another middleware. So let's say middleware A was going to be executed before middleware B, and middleware B knew that A was going to do something, so it's going to, once it receives a response or request, it's going to be looking at maybe some of these attributes and be like, okay, what did A do? Oh, A did this, so I'm going to change my response based on what A did. So is that right?
Right.
Yeah, but it doesn't need to be thinking in terms of what did A do. It needs to be thinking in terms of, by the time this middleware is called, I'm going to assume that there's an attribute called controller that's been defined, and then I'm going to invoke that.
Okay.
Whether that was another middleware that created that, whether that was a routing process, whatever that is kind of irrelevant. It's just, informal contract that PSR-7 doesn't define, that the property called _controller or _action, if you're in Aura, or whatever it's going to be, has this special meaning. And as long as that's been defined by the time you get there, cool. Which also means it becomes really easy to test those middlewares independent of each other, because you just set up your request and pass it in, and you're good to go.
Cool. I'd like to talk a little bit about implementing PSR-7 on an actual project. And for the project that I want to use as an example, it would be the Facebook PHP SDK, because I feel like it would be an excellent candidate for PSR-7, and it's the one that I'm most familiar with, so I'm going to ask a lot of questions for it. But what would be maybe the first step of implementing PSR-7 for the SDK as looking at the feature set of the SDK? The primary functionality that it provides is basically an authenticated client that interfaces with the Graph API at Facebook. So it goes through the whole like OAuth 2.0 process to get an access token, and then all of a sudden you can send requests on behalf of a user. Where would PSR-7 play a role in in that package?
I would actually ask why you're not using Guzzle. Because Guzzle 6 now is built on PSR-7, and so its request and response messages are all PSR-7. All you're doing really is providing a wrapper around HTTP to provide Facebook-specific commands and API calls. I just stick Guzzle inside your code, and it actually has tools for extending it to provide that kind of authentication and so on. And then you don't have to worry about PSR-7 per se. You worry about Guzzle and go to town.
That's a really great advice. Would love to get that implemented. We've been advocating that one actually for the past year. So it's really hard to get the Facebook guys on board with adding dependencies.
Right.
So even though you can install the PHP SDK with Guzzle, with Composer, they don't want to have any dependencies because a lot of the people using the PHP SDK for Facebook don't use Composer. So we've got an autoloader in there. So I mean, I guess we could like add Guzzle. Just add it to the code base and stuff, but I don't know. It's a little tricky. We're trying to figure that out, and maybe we'll eventually get them to adopt Composer dependencies.
Tell them that Amazon's already doing it and they're behind.
Well, you know, they also have the Guzzle developer lead on their team, so I mean, it's
also true.
They've got an unfair advantage.
True that.
Well, let's throw this back at you then. What do you think you would gain by having the Facebook SDK use PSR-7?
I would hope that right now with the what they're called, there's Facebook request and Facebook response, and they have their own implementation of something that looks very similar to PSR-7. But it would be nice to be able to just take directly from the SDK a Facebook response, inject it into a PSR-7 compliant middleware stack or whatever you want to call it, and just start playing, without any sort of boilerplate code or anything like that. Just have it automatically start working with other packages nicely.
So I'd actually say, you say other package there, that's the key phrase. If part of your goal is to have no dependencies on other packages, then PSR-7 is probably not going to help you that much. Where it would help you is if you want to say, you know what, I need to talk to Facebook using OAuth. There's this OAuth library out here already that takes care of the ugliness that is OAuth. And, it wants a PSR-7 object. So if I can give it a PSR-7 request that I'm about to send and say, here, do your magic signing on this, and then it gives you back a new request that has been signed, that's where PSR-7 is helpful. Because then you can say, I don't need to write a bridge from Facebook request to signer request and then back again. You just use the PSR-7 objects all the way through, and all that conversion code disappears.
Right.
That's really where the benefit is that you can get rid of a lot of new code to translate from this representation to this representation, so that you can put into this library and bring it back out and translate it back. That just goes away. But if you're not using any other libraries, then you're not really going to benefit from that necessarily.
Right. Well, ideally, we would be able to just remove all of the HTTP client stuff that we wrote and just have use Guzzle, and that would just take out probably half of the code. But I did want to ask about specifically streams, because I know bodies are treated as streams in PSR-7, and there's actually a streaming interface, or I don't know what the actual
Stream interface.
Stream interface, yeah, where you can read sections of code. I'm assuming, is there like a cursor in there where you can
Yes.
Get the next chunk kind of thing?
Yeah, you can call read. There's an EOF. There's seek. All those things that you'd expect out of a stream are right there.
Cool. So Facebook recently added a feature in Graph 2.3, so it's really new, where you could upload videos in chunks, and it requires at minimum 3 requests to the Graph API. The first one initiates the request with the size of the file. Then you have a series of requests that actually sends chunks of the file. And then the last one would, after all the chunks have been sent, you send all the metadata associated with that to finalize the uploading of that video. I guess my question is, could the Facebook PHP SDK adopt the stream interface for PSR-7 to implement that specific feature?
Yes, and that's actually Michael Dowling. He was the editor prior to me on PSR-7. He was the one who proposed the stream interface, and he writes Guzzle. And that's one of the big use cases that a lot of APIs have, is having to be able to work with chunked responses or chunked requests. And that's why part of the reason that he really wanted to have the stream implementation in there is that it simplifies that aspect of it. So you can send off these chunks, and essentially your client can be taking care of doing the right thing in terms of sending the data in the right sequence. But programmatically, I'm just saying send it, right? And then the SDK or the client library can do that. So absolutely, and I would again, that's an argument for using Guzzle, but if nothing else, you can take a look at it and see how Guzzle has implemented that.
Right. Well, so are you? I'm sorry, Beau. I'm gonna mute. There you go. Cool. Gotcha. You're on it. You got unmuted. So Matthew, on the streaming thing, right now in Facebook, when I send a chunk, it actually I don't determine how much of a chunk I send. Facebook will respond with, okay, now send me this many bytes. Do I use the stream interface for both the response and the request? So I create like a response, a stream object that tells me how much to chunk off, and then send a stream object that actually sends the chunk, or is that like a typical setup?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I know how this stuff operates in theory. I don't do a whole lot with the client-side stuff where I'm sending stuff client-side, so I haven't played with this aspect of it. But when I was looking at the proposed, there's a Guzzle Streams project that Michael worked on that was showing how you might do these. Essentially, the idea was that the client was he had this, the chunk request and the chunk response, and the idea was that it would send off the request. It would be told, what are the chunk sizes that I can send, and it would just keep firing off requests and going, iterating through the stream and sending up to that amount of chunk until it finished all the different requests that were necessary in order to send the file.
True that.
Whereas for you as a developer, all you're doing is saying, here's a request, and here's the name of a file on disk, because that is a stream in PHP, and the rest of it is just taken care of off over there, and you're done. Which
is what the Facebook SDK would do at that point. So that Facebook SDK would be doing that, that figuring out how to chunk it and everything, but it would propose a simpler interface for the end user who would just take a look at it and say, okay, send, and we're done.
Well, that's actually the discussion that's going on right now, is how much of that do we abstract from the user? And I'm sort of on the side of kind of giving the user a little bit more flexibility of how it's chunked, and like taking control of, like, if a chunk fails, then you get a retry, and then how many tries do you get to before you fail, and that kind of stuff. And it also kind of educates the developer about how the API works. Whereas if I were to just kind of give them a simple method that says send this file, and it does all that stuff for them, they have no idea how this is actually being done. So I feel like there's this whole simple versus simple versus easy, Ryan Weaver's thing that he talks about like how easy do we make something, or how simple do we make something, and but
there's also another aspect here, and that's the developer experience, right? And does the developer really want to or need to know about the underlying details of how the HTTP works, or do they just need to know how to call the method?
Right.
And that's a question. If they want to, really, they could always dig into the source code and find out how that's implemented.
That's true.
But in terms of the developer experience, is it easier to expose a send method, or is it easier, or is it better to say, okay, well, you're sending a chunked response with this one, so you might want to do this so that you can test it. I mean, that gets complex, and it's easily overwhelming as well. So there's two different sides of the coin. It's nice to have the flexibility, but it's also really, really nice for the end user to just be able to have that one thing that they interact with.
Which is where my usual guideline is robust primitives. So, for any given level you're working at, you want to have a really robust set of well-encapsulated primitive operations and primitive values that you're dealing with, and use that to build the next layer of really robust primitives and really robust operations that could be dissected if necessary without going all the way down the rabbit hole. So, for example, you don't have to think about array structures when you're dealing with PSR-7. You're dealing with these object interfaces. You don't care what the implementation is. You don't care about, there's some cases in which HTTP is case insensitive and some where it's case sensitive, and most of that's taken care of for you. So your primitive is the message definition. On top of that, you build a primitive that is sending that message over, serializing that to HTTP and sending it in the appropriate fashion to a stream. On top of that, you build taking a message and chunking it into pieces to send multiple times. On top of that, you build your business logic around, I want to send this file. And then each layer takes care of its primitives, but you can jump down one layer at a time if you need to, but you don't have to, provided each of those layers is done well. That is hard to do well. Really thinking in terms of layered primitives rather than I just want to do this thing, so I'm going to put some code into a function and it's going to do it and now I leave, is hard. But that is what builds robust systems. That's what builds systems that don't need to get rewritten every 2 years. That's what builds systems that can interoperate with each other because you can share those primitives. And that's a lot of what FIG in many ways tries to do is, those primitives that make sense to be common, things like HTTP messaging, things like logging, let's abstract those, let's build those primitives so that we can then build the next layer of primitives on top of those, which could vary between projects, and that's okay. But
Right.
that, we're dealing with a better vocabulary than strings, ints, and superglobals.
And this is something I definitely want to tackle in a future episode, some of these very topics. So this is a really big one that we love to get it more detail on, but I want to shift gears a little bit and just look at some of the criticisms behind PSR-7, and one that was happening kind of more recently. There's a few tweets sent out by Taylor Otwell, the guy who created Laravel, and the tweets, I've got 3 of them here that I'll just read them in order here. He said, the fact that some PSR-7 implementations actually prevent you from simply doing new response hello world will forever boggle my mind. I think it is a very strong sentiment that the fact that very small people can do really silly things when designing software. Takeaway lesson, always build for developer experience. It's sort of kind of what we were just talking about.
I think it was smart people, not small people.
Oh, did I say small? Oh my gosh. Thank you. Very smart people.
Yes.
I'll tackle this one because there's actually been some interesting discussion around this one. I saw this one, and my immediate response was, well, then extend or create a factory for the response in order to do this. Larry and I actually had a lot of discussions, and the funny part is he's actually targeting specifically Zendirectoros, which I was developing all along with the specification that was originally Fly HTTP, now it's Zendirectoros. So I was developing this along with the specification for PSR-7 so that we would have an implementation that we could play around with, which was great because it facilitated Larry with playing with the stack clone and everything so that we could play and see what worked and what didn't. Larry and I talked a lot about the constructors, and the fact is that the request and the response are generic. They're not just server, they're client-side as well. And for a client-side, for the response, you're going to be parsing the message, and you want to be able to put in, here's the status code, here's the headers, here's the content, right? And you want to put that in very quickly. So Larry and I had quite a few discussions about what should be in the constructor, what order and everything that would make sense for a general purpose use case. Now, no, that doesn't work great with Hello World. But I wasn't thinking developer experience at this point. I was thinking, what is a general use case? For those more specific use cases, for instance, on the server side where you might just have a string, which might be HTML, might be JSON, whatever, then there are some ways that we can make this simpler. So right after this went out, somebody actually went and created a pull request against Zendirectoros, and essentially they wanted to add a static from string method. And I'm like, hell no. And I didn't mean to be rude, but I'm like, the whole point was like, this will not work. It's like, from string, what does that mean? Is it the HTTP message string? If so, we need to parse it. And I actually already have another class that does exactly that. But if we're talking about something, a string response, then maybe we need to have an extension or a factory for doing this. And so they started talking, well, sometimes I want to do HTML, sometimes JSON. So I then proposed, okay, how about a factory class that we call Zendirectoros response, string response, that has factory methods that will then return just a response, and it would create the stream from there. And so if we said from JSON, we could give it some data, and if the data isn't a string, it goes and serializes it via JSON encode, that sort of thing. And it's been fun because I've been working with this guy, and he started off and he was all upset because I wasn't just going to merge his thing, and tweeted at Taylor, and Taylor's like, oh, that's obtuse. And I said, listen, I'm not saying I'm not going to accept it, but I'm saying we need to change the approach. I worked with this developer, and now he's actually like, oh my gosh, I really like where this is going, and so he's very excited about this, and now he's seeing why it's implemented the way it is, but also how he can work within that framework in order to build something that is also developer friendly. We have these nice low-level objects, but it doesn't mean that you can't build a nice developer experience on top of it, and that's the cool part.
And I think that goes to the point we talked about earlier. Well, both points we talked about earlier. One is the layered primitives, but also what you were talking about at the start of the podcast, that a lot of these things seem really easy at first and seem really simple until you dig into them and realize, oh, there's a lot more complexity here that we need to account for. And then, okay, now what do we build on top of that? So, for example, when I was working on the stack clone back in January, I also wanted to return just a string for the response because that's as much as I was dealing with. So I had a class that implemented the stream interface, actually extended from one of Matthew's classes, and had a string property inside it. And it meant instead of doing new response string, I did new response new string, and then a class name string, and then its constructor was a string, and it worked just fine, and everything was worked. So would it make sense to have a response implementation that just internalizes that logic into its constructor? Yeah, maybe go and write one. It'd be really easy, and it would still work with everything else precisely because of the common interface. So as long as it's still a stream internally, when once it gets past that constructor, it's still going to work with every other middleware out there. Okay, so you had a junior implementation, that's fine. The fact that we can support that and support something that's going to stream a 2 GB file, and something that's going to stream, a database query that's running and generating code, at runtime to generate the output on the fly. All of those are supported, and that's great. And that's the hallmark of a good interface, is that you can hide that kind of detail and then simplify in cases where you need to, or make it easy, or paper over things, or make assumptions. And in other cases, don't, and it still all works together. So, if Taylor wants to write that kind of interface or that kind of implementation, I'm sure it'll take him, what, an hour, 2 hours? He's a good developer. Yeah. Just extend from Diactoros and change the constructor, and he's good to go. So, yeah.
Exactly.
So,
and that's what I think is really cool about how all this stuff works is that we have this really nice, solid interfaces at the lower level. We have some very nice general implementations, and now you can start building that developer experience that might be specific to your library on top of that, and yet it will still all interoperate.
I think the problem there, though, as far as developer experience goes, is that, for example, in Taylor's case, if he were to build some sort of factory class or whatever to build these sorts of things correctly, it's going to tie him to a Diactoros, for example.
Right.
It'll tie him to one of the implementations. So the fact
and that was the argument I was talking about earlier too with the middleware, was that if you don't pass that response into the middleware, you are tied to a concretion, even if it's just a factory. And that's one of the pieces that one of the pros and cons you want to look at is, what do I want to tie my framework to or my project to?
Yep.
You look like you have more to say, Beau.
This whole conversation has been making me think about the FIG cookies package, and as an example of a project that is taking in PSR-7 primitives and working with them quite effectively without having its own implementation. Like it doesn't care who it's working with. I don't know if have you actually worked with it yet, Matthew?
I've played with it a little bit here and there on my site just to see how it would, how things would work out, but nothing offensive.
Does it work as advertised so far?
So far.
Yeah. I mean, within the PSR-7 interface, it seems to be working. I have a test suite where I've implemented just a tiny bit of PSR-7 request and response, and it seems to work okay. But that's a case where, similar to what Larry was talking about, there's the PSR-7 primitives. And then I have the cookies and set cookies primitives, and then I have a facade in front of all of that to make it easier. Focus on the DX, and it's been one step closer every time. Someone just submitted a pull request with an example of a forever cookie. So basically a forever constructor on it, and it all works. Like, it's all going to work just fine because it's built on these layers of primitives that go they get more primitive as you go further down the stack. So I think it's going to work out quite well for everybody. It's just going to take a while to get used to it, I think.
Yep.
And I think it's also a valid point. Anytime you are typing new, you're binding yourself to a concretion. So, and that concretion includes the constructor, which is not part of the interface because PHP current versions don't let you, I think. maybe it's the other way around. But so you're going to be bound to a concretion if you're using the constructor. So you're bound to whatever that particular implementation's constructor looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Pick one. So pick the concretion you like. As long as it's following the interface, everything else still works with it, and you're good.
Yeah.
Larry, you and I need more concretions because we're in Chicago and there's lots of potholes.
So, was that a joke from earlier?
We just have, after, it snows a lot, so there's lots of snow plows and we get lots of potholes, so we need more concrete on the roads,
And the city's broke, so we still haven't fixed them even though it's June.
Yes. So I want to kind of wrap it up here because we're kind of going over an hour, but real quick, how do you guys foresee PSR-7 impacting the zeitgeist of the PHP community and the culture and the PHP ecosystem in the coming years?
I'll jump in. My hope along this is that we'll get better interoperability. Like I said, when I first came into this, I was looking at Node, and one of the things that was amazing about Node was that you'd have all these different frameworks. They would all be defining different middleware and everything, but they all were using the same abstractions. And as a result, that was why it was so easy for us to build something so quickly, was that we could just pull any random package and we didn't have to worry about whether or not those requests and responses were for that particular one. They all used the same one. And that made things terribly easy for me as a developer. And I didn't have to think about that. I learned one API, I'm really good to go, which is fantastic. And I want to see that in the PHP ecosystem, because this is really where the frameworks have been setting up their fiefdoms, is really around how they handle HTTP. And it's stupid because as a result, you cannot reuse code from one to the next. And so one person might build a content negotiation system in Symfony. I can't use it easily in Zen Framework without building a bridge, and you can't use it in Slim PHP at all. That sucks. I don't want that situation at all for PHP developers. I want us to solve, have one or two packages that solve it well. I can look at those, and I don't have to think about which one's compatible. I just use it. And that's really, really what I want to see happening in the PHP ecosystem, and that's what I want to enable with this.
Amen, Reverend.
And on that amen, we should probably start wrapping this thing up.
Somehow.
Absolutely.
So in addition to everything Matthew just said, which I completely agree with, I think there's a potential for the fact that PSR-7 is immutable to start encouraging others to take that approach to immutability, and I think that would be a very, very good thing.
Absolutely.
Because once you have the setup properly and the pattern to make the DX and the developer experience of an immutable object good, like PSR-7 does, then you get a lot of other benefits and a lot of other assumptions you can make, and that just can spider out through your code. And that encourages more loose coupling, that encourages stronger typing, that encourages just not having to deal with certain problems. I'm a big fan of the idea of something being a solved problem and you just move on from it, rather than constantly revisiting it. So like we've been talking about some future FIG work around link handling, for example. And that's something that someone might want to attach to this is like link headers, essentially, that type of link. That's something you might want to put onto a particular response, for example. Great. That means it also needs to be immutable, which means those objects are going to need to be immutable as well, which means, and I think there's a potential for a really nice knock-on effect there, especially as we move into PHP 7 later this year, which has much better typing support. I think those two things together are going to be the foundation of the next big wave of PHP. We're kind of the 5.3/6 era is going to be winding down, and I think PSR-7 and PHP 7 are going to be the foundations of the next piece of PHP's evolution, the next era for us.
Can you believe that PHP 5.4 end of life is going to be in less than 3 months?
That's scary.
PHP is moving a little faster than it used to. It's kind of exciting at the same time. Like maybe we'll get faster upgrades as we move on. All right, let's move this thing on to the developer shout out as we sum it up here. And this is one of my favorite things about to PHP Roundtables because, PHP Roundtable focuses on community and how awesome everybody is, and everybody is just like doing all this great stuff, and sometimes they don't get necessarily the recognition that they deserve. So this segment recognizes those people and gives them a little gift, and today's gift is sponsored by Laracasts.com, and they are providing a $50 Amazon gift card to recognize the developer for this episode. And if you don't know, Laracast is the Netflix for developers. And if you're listening to PHP Roundtable because you're trying to learn more about PHP, then you're just going to love Laracast because Jeffrey Way is the guy who runs it, and he's got all these screencasts. I think he's got 500. He just tweeted, I think today, that 500 screencasts he's got up there. And it shows you step-by-step how to do really cool things with PHP. And I'm a personal subscriber, and I've learned tons from Jeffrey, so definitely check that out. So for this episode, the panel nominated somebody who actually had some contributions in a very unique way to PSR-7, and that's Everett Pott. Matthew, why did you guys choose Everett Pott to recognize for the developer shout-out?
So Everett has been involved with PSR-7 for a very long time and contributed a whole bunch to it. But what was very interesting was just before our first review period, he actually wrote a blog post saying what he thought was wrong with it. And it's basically he's saying, I'm not going to vote for it. Here's what I think is wrong with it, and kind of urging others to do it. In the end, even after the second review period, he was still the only person to dissent. But what was phenomenal about this whole thing was that even after he voiced those concerns, he continued to collaborate with us and work on improving the library. And that sort of collaboration, even in the face of saying, I don't agree with the direction, you don't see a lot of. It's mostly, I hate this and therefore it's wrong. And that doesn't help anybody, but it's like, I don't like this, but I see where it's going, and here's something that I think could be better than what you're currently doing. Take a look, and actively helping shape it for the better, regardless of his personal feelings for it. And that, to me, is just a phenomenal spirit of collaboration, and that's why I wanted to nominate him.
That's one of the coolest things about open source is that you can even have like these conflicts or negative feelings or anything, but they a lot of times can turn into something really good if everybody is kind of open-minded about what people are actually saying and trying to listen to their criticism. So this is it's all about love. So Everett, I will be trying to get in contact with you to get your address and send this $50 Amazon gift card to you and a personal thank you card and some a PHP Roundtable sticker that's really big. I'm trying to hand out these stickers to people at Tech, and I had a lot of people were like, I'm not putting that on my computer. It's like half the size of my computer. It's like, but I tell them to use it as a base. You put it on the base of the computer, and then you can put other stickers on top of it, so it's like a sticker holder. The next set of stickers will be smaller than this. You live and you learn.
Yeah.
All right. So,
and actually, before we continue,
yeah.
I'd like to also, I know technically it's against the rules since he's here, but I also want to give a shout out to Matthew. Because I've been in FIG for several years now. It can be kind of contentious. It can be a rough and tumble place. Matthew's dying of laughter here now. But Matthew as editor was just amazingly calm and collected and diplomatic, way past where I would be.
You certainly didn't went on the emails to Beau and Paul that
I just want to say thank you to Matthew. Without that, this wouldn't have happened. This is really your leadership that made it work, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yay! Everybody's clapping at home. I can hear them. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this up with some shameless plugs. We'll go around. Larry, do you have anything that you want to plug?
Drupal 8 coming out this fall. Just going to rock your socks as a CMS. I'm speaking at every conference I can find this year about Drupal 8 and developing for it. So watch for me at a conference near you, and watch for a book with my name on it at some point in the near-ish future after it's released.
Nice. What about you, Beau? You have anything you want to promote?
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to my podcast, That Podcast, and my co-host, Dave Marshall. We just actually launched episode 20 today, and we've been around. I think Tech would have been our 1-year anniversary, so this is the first episode of year 2. So, yeah. Cool. If you can come check it out, let us know what you think.
Excellent. And Matthew, you got anything?
Yeah, a couple of things. First off, I work on Zen Framework and App Agility. One of the things that we've just changed is we've split all the components off into their own repositories with their own lifelines, which means that going forward, they're going to be versioned on their own, and they're going to be much more granular. So start checking those out again if you've ignored them because they're part of a monolithic package. I think you're going to be surprised at what you start seeing in the future. Diactoros and Strategility are two of those. So you can start to see what the future of Zen Framework looks like. Just a quick thank you to Beau. Beau was incredibly helpful and supportive during the entire lifetime of PSR-7. I couldn't have asked for a better sponsor. So.
Nice. Yes. Well, cool. Well, our next episode is going to be PHP's major bus factor problem, and this was inspired by a lively open spaces talk at PHP Tech this past year. We're going to have some really cool people coming on and talking about this little thing that, I don't know, it should be interesting. I've never had a PHP roundtable that's going to be quite like it, so we'll see where it goes.
Is this Liz Smith's doing?
She's not in that one, but some other lively folks. Yeah, it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to it. If you have something you'd like to share about a particular topic that PHP nerds care about, you need to be on this panel. So just hit me up on Twitter if you're interested. My Twitter handle is SammyK, or just ping PHP Roundtable. And finally, I'd just like to thank Larry, Matthew, and Beau for joining us for this discussion, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.